Hello and welcome to IFG Live for today's Institute for Government event on how local leaders can help England to reach net zero, which is also the subject of a report we published in February called Net Zero and Devolution. The Institute for Government is delighted to be working in partnership with the Royal Society to bring you this event. So many thanks to the RS for their kind support of our work. My name is Akash Pound. I'm Programme Director for Devolution here at the IFG, and I'll be chairing today's conversation with our excellent panellists, who I'll be introducing in a moment. We'll be discussing what progress the country has made so far with reducing carbon emissions, the state of the government strategy for reaching net zero by the target date of 2050, and then really focusing on the specific role that local leaders, metro mayors, local council leaders can play, for instance, via their control of transport, housing, retrofit, skills budgets. And we'll also be talking about whether further devolution could help England's cities and regions and the country as a whole, therefore, to go further and faster with decarbonisation. So thanks very much to you all for joining, and thank you to our four speakers for spending the time to talk us through these questions. So first of all, warm welcome to Professor Joanna Haigh, who's Fellow of the Royal Society, our partners on this event, a Research Fellow at Imperial College London, and formerly co-director of the Grantham Institute, also at Imperial College. Jo, thanks for joining us. Thanks. And second, our speaker joining us from here at the IFG, my colleague Rosa Hodgkin, who works on policy making and net zero, and previously worked as an analyst for the climate think tank Influence Map. Hi Rosa, how are you doing?
Oh, great to be here.
Great, thanks a lot for joining us. Third, welcome to Shirley Rodriguez, who is London's Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy, a post she's held since 2016, and in that role she's working to help deliver the Mayor of London's environment strategy for the city. Shirley, delighted to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And finally, we're joined by Ed Cox, who works closely with Metro Mayor Andy Street as Executive Director for Strategy, Economy and Net Zero at the West Midlands Combined Authority. Ed, hello, good to see you again. So I'll be putting questions to our panelists in a moment. To our online audience, those of you watching live, you can submit questions to any individual panelist or the panel as a whole via the Q&A function on Teams, and I will weave some of the questions into the conversation. You can also upvote other people's suggestions for what I should ask, and do please say who you are and where you're from if you don't mind being identified. The event's being recorded and it'll be uploaded to our website, our YouTube and podcast channels shortly afterwards. We're also live tweeting the event from the IFG events account using the hashtag IFGNetZero. Okay, so let's get started. So for Professor Haigh, Jo, I'd like to start with you. The UK has reduced its carbon emissions by nearly 50% now since the early 1990s, largely due to a big shift in the way that the country produces electricity, so shift away from coal coal power stations in particular. Given where we are now and the mix of carbon emissions that the country still has to eliminate, what do you see as the biggest challenges we face if the country is to reach that 2050 target? And as it stands now, do you think we are on track to meet that?
Well, as you say, we need to reach net zero by 2050, and if nobody's clear about that, it's because carbon dioxide in particular is very long lived in the atmosphere, and once it gets in there, it'll stay there, and the surface temperature responds to that. So the more CO2 in the atmosphere, the warmer it gets. So we need to stop emitting in order to stop the temperature rising. That's a very clear thing to do. and to limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, which is what the UN Interpanel on Climate Change said is necessary to avoid the worst responses to climate change. We need to adapt the whole of the activity and strong action by everybody. National governments, devolved governments, private sector, local government, civil society, communities, households, and all the economic sectors. So in the UK, we were sort of ahead of the game for a while. And earlier in the century, we established 6 carbon budgets, 6 5-year carbon budgets, each centred on from 2010, centred on 2010, 2015, 2020, etc. They're enshrined in law, so the government is required to meet them. And the first 3 have actually been met. We're now in the middle of the 4th carbon budget. Looks like we're sort of on track to meet that. The 5th one's a bit more shaky, but there's really not on track to meet the 6th carbon budget, which is around 2035, and this is a real concern. It's to reduce the emissions by 78% by that time. So a huge transformation is necessary. Outside the electricity sector, which we've already heard about, then annual emissions need to be reduced by 4.7% per year in order to meet that target, and at the moment it's 1.2% per year, so you can see we're nowhere near on track to meet that to meet the 6th carbon budget. And it will need action in all the sector, transport, industry, buildings, heating, all the rest of them to do stuff. The Climate Change Committee, which is a government advisory body, has suggested that agriculture and land use policy is particularly badly designed, or not at all, and also there needs to be much more attention to the planning system, but all the all the economic sectors need addressing. There was a court case, interesting court case brought last year by Client Earth and partners including Friends of the Earth, which required the UK to produce a carbon budget delivery plan, so the government to describe how it was going to meet these carbon budgets. And indeed they published one in March this year, but it's been widely criticised as relying much too heavily on unproven and high-risk technologies such as carbon capture and hydrogen, and not on near-term action in doing stuff now. So I think particularly Client Earth is going to seek a judicial review on that. Recent government decisions on the Cumbrian coal mine, on North Sea gas permits, the delay in the ban on fossil fuel car sales are all very disappointing and not going to help at all. I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Jo. That's a really helpful overview of where we are and what needs to be done. Rosa, I'd like to come to you next. I mean, you've written for the IFG on the government's strategy and approach to tackling climate change. I mean, what's your assessment? What is the state of the government's strategy, and in particular, what role does it see for local leaders in helping with decarbonisation and reaching net zero?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this question of, does it have a credible strategy? And the answer I came up with was sort of. So at a very high level, as Joanna was saying, it's published this carbon budget delivery plan after the previous plan was challenged in court. And it sets out kind of these are the policies it sees using to hit net zero. But it's a very tight path. It really doesn't leave a lot of space at all for things going wrong or for kind of future changes in policy. So, for example, the announcement that we saw on a 20% exemption for fossil fuel boiler phase out, the Climate Change Committee said that had really increased the risks of hitting net zero by 2050. So there is a strategy, but it really requires delivery to start at pace now. And at the moment, the pace of policy development and delivery is just not there, really, in terms of us hitting both 2050 and also the interim targets in 2030, which the Climate Change Committee has said it thinks it's unlikely that the UK is going to hit. When it comes to the role of local leaders, the government has said quite a lot on local authorities. which are already delivering some parts of this, particularly when you look at social housing retrofit, for example. It's said a lot less on mayors. I had a quick look through the carbon budget delivery plan. I could only find 2 mentions of mayors in there compared to quite a few more mentions of local authorities. So I don't think it's been particularly clear on the role for either, but it's definitely said more about local authorities than about local leaders like mayors. But the main thing I would say, both in terms of the government's overall strategy and in terms of the role of local leaders, is what we kind of still need is more clarity about who the government sees doing what by when. So ideally, you'd like it to be kind of, we've got 7 years to 2030, we've got 27 years to 2050. These are the things we think need to be delivered. This is what we see being delivered by this group at this time, so that then people had a sense of what they were being expected to deliver, what kind of support they were going to get to facilitate that, and could kind of plan ahead for what they needed to be doing at what point.
Great, thanks, Rosa. Okay, so Shirley, I'd like to come to you now. I mean, we've heard already quite a bit about the 2050 target. Greater London, the Mayor of London, has set a much more ambitious, maybe aspirational target of making London a net zero city region by 2030. So in just 7 years or so. Do you want to tell us a bit about that target and what the GLA and the mayor and yourself are doing using devolved powers to try and make progress towards that, as I say, quite imminent deadline that you've set yourself of 2030?
So I sort of agree with Joe and Rosa, I think, on their analysis. Really, I think the role of local mayors is absolutely critical, and local leaders in delivery. And what we're not getting is clarity on the pathway, the support, whether it's powers or funding. So in the absence of that, I think it is reliant on local leaders to take up the mantle, and that's what the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has done. So he declared a climate emergency in 2018 and brought forward his target from 2050 for London to be a net zero carbon city to 2030, precisely because of the urgency of action that's needed, not just in the UK but globally. We're seeing the impacts of climate change already in around the world, in the UK and in London particularly. People who may remember the sort of extreme heat events, the wildfires that we saw destroying homes in London, flash flooding events, increasing frequency and severity of that. And we've been very lucky, I think, not to have had a really bad sort of experience like New York has done, where we've seen sort of loss of life and so on. But so having said we want to bring forward our target, we've done what I think Rosa was talking about, trying to understand what the challenge is. So we commissioned some research to identify 4 scenarios that we might take to try to get to 2030, and the Mayor has selected one which looked at the sort of pragmatic approach, but even that has just sets out the scale of the challenge we have to meet. Sort of 200,000 homes a year need to be retrofitted, 26,500 commercial buildings have to be retrofitted. We've got to connect up heat pumps in the order of 2 to 3 million heat pumps by 2030 if we're going to do all of this, let alone reducing vehicle kilometers so that we can cut transport emissions. But having identified that challenge, we are all at the GLA and the associated organisations like Transport for London, and working very closely with London local authorities through their representative organisation, London councils, are trying to come together on some of those big challenges. We don't have all the powers that we need, so that the strongest powers that the Mayor has always been planning, then transport, and then over time, as there has been some devolution, we have some control over the education budget on skills, for example, housing as well. But we don't have control, for example, over the ability to retrofit our homes or buildings in London. That the sort of setting of energy efficiency standards and the ability to fund that is distributed, and we have to go through this ridiculous bidding cycle that local authorities have to do with very little time, changing of policy, and then having to hand back funding, so that there is no long-term sort of funding pot, single funding pot, clarity of policy that we can then just gone with it. And obviously local authorities understand much better what the needs are, what we need to do in London, and the makeup of our city is going to be very different from how Ed deals with issues in the West Midlands, with Andy. But Sadiq always says it's the good news. The good news is that even with the powers that we have made huge strides. So on planning, for example, we were able to set tougher standards. The government did away with I think it was the Future Homes Standard, or the equivalent of that. We were able to retain that, and we've seen, because of that drive through the planning policy we've set in London, the London Plan, we've been delivering emissions reductions that are 50% greater than are required by building regulations, and that's because we've set that long-term policy. And that set the signal to developers who are bringing that forward with no impact really on delivery of homes or buildings. In fact, on emissions, we're seeing that per capita emissions better than this UK, I think, partly because of the density, and because we're also, because we have reliance on good public transport and so on. On vehicle reductions, we've seen through, for example, the expansion of the ultra low emission zone, we've seen many thousands, tens of thousands of vehicles coming off our road, which is going to help both air quality but also climate change. We're cleaning up our buses. We have I think something in the order of 1,200 buses that are electric or hydrogen. We have a third of the UK's electric vehicle charging points. These are all policy driven within the gift of the sort of what we have, but we think that we could do much more if those powers and funding were devolved to local leaders, local mayors.
Okay, great. And yeah, I definitely want to return shortly to that specific question of further devolution and whether London is on the path for a new devolution deal, which nice segue to the West Midlands. So Ed, West Midlands also has an earlier net zero target, 2041. In your case, West Midlands has also recently concluded a further devolution deal, a trailblazer deal as it's called, which will provide additional powers, potentially including some of those things that London doesn't have, like greater control of retrofitting, for example. So, I mean, I'm interested to hear from you, first of all. I mean, what progress have you been able to make with the powers you already have or have had, over the past few years, in reducing emissions? And then what do you think the new powers coming on stream are going to enable you to do that other places like London could then learn from?
Sure. Well, thanks, Akash. I mean, there's a lot going on, and there's not enough time to kind of cover it all off in just the short time we've got together. So I will just give you a flavour, but you're absolutely right. We set an evidence-based target similar to the way Shirley described for Greater London of 2041 based on various scenarios. And then we've developed what's known as our 5-year plan. So the first 5 years to 2041, and within that there are 15 goals. So again, all very evidence-based. But then you have to look at those 15 goals and say, well, what is it that we can actually do? And I think we see the role of the mayor and the combined authority as, if you like, a convener, a leader. And I think it's really important just to make this point that we're not doing this for government. Sometimes we have conversations which sound as though the only reason local authorities or combined authorities get up in the morning is because government has given them some powers or given them something that they can do. We're doing this because the West Midlands has huge economic and environmental opportunities, and we're seeking to seize those. The extent to which government helps us to do that, I think, is highly contingent, and we'll come back to that when we talk a bit more about devolution. But I think it's really important to say up front that as a political leader in his own right, the Mayor of the West Midlands is driving a low carbon agenda because it is the right thing to do, not because government says it's the right thing to do. And indeed, I'll make this point now that, you know, one of the constraints on devolution in relation to decarbonisation is that the government consistently says, well, we've got legally binding targets and therefore can we trust you to do things? And our argument would be, well, just pass on those legally binding targets to us and we will absolutely make the progress that we need to make. So just to give you a flavour of some of the areas in which we're working, transport obviously is a huge area, as Shirley has referenced. We've just developing a new local transport plan that puts the decarbonisation absolutely at the centre of all of that. Specific projects like Coventry Electric Bus City. I think it's the first city to have 100% electric buses. But, you know, the progress is slow. It's very, very challenging to get people out of their cars, particularly when, as a conurbation like the West Midlands, you know, it's sort of the car conurbation in that sense. So there's some big challenges there. Huge constraints on transport revenue funding as well. So that makes providing a public transport system that much more difficult in the current financial environment. On energy, we've got our own energy agency, Energy Capital, that have done some amazing work. We've got a regional energy strategy, lots of innovation around heat networks, local area energy planning and that kind of thing. But again, critical strategic role that we play is in convening energy systems partners. We have something called the Net Zero Infrastructure Delivery Panel, the first region to pull together all of the providers, the energy infrastructure companies onto one panel where we can hold them to account in a much greater way. And now Ofgem have seen that and said, right, we need something called regional energy strategic planning. Very invisible, not very retail politics, but something that's incredibly important and that makes possible the kind of announcement that the Chancellor made last week about connecting us, making grid connections that much more effective for business. On domestic retrofit, huge amount there. I mean, the way in which government provides retrofit funding through these tiny competitions that all our different local authorities and registered providers have to bid for time and time again, with very narrow constraints, both in terms of the timescales to deliver, but also what it can be spent on, is incredibly difficult and certainly inhibits the market from developing. So what we've done as a combined authority is to try to convene registered providers, local authorities, and put in you know, collaborative bids for government funding, so we get the scale. So I think we've got £80 million worth of retrofit funding ongoing at the moment. That helps us then to shape the local market, to build the skills, and to really get that system going, but it's still very piecemeal. We're also have a demonstrator program where what we're trying to do is what we call net zero neighbourhoods, where we look at a whole range of different ways in which we can decarbonise in a particular neighbourhood, hinging around retrofit. And again, I think government has seen that as an example of how you can do this more systematically. So as part of our Trailblazer devolution deal now, it looks as though we're going to have what they're describing as a retrofit pilot, which will mean that we can actually have 5 years worth of guaranteed funding around retrofit, so that we can actually unlock some of that demonstrator approach and shape the market to a much greater effect. And of course, with the housing funding that we've got as well, we've got to make sure that we're building houses that aren't going to need retrofitting. So again, like Shirley, we've got a future home strategy, which kind of ramps up the conditions upon which we can apply to developers who are wanting to build new homes. Lots of work on environment and adaptation. I haven't got time to go through it all, so I won't. Don't panic. But we've got a regional tree strategy. We've helped plant 500,000 trees in the last 18 months or so. A regional climate adaptation strategy. We're doing lots of work on the circular economy. We have a roadmap around that, and we've just the Combined Authority Board has just published a regional air quality framework, so lots of work on air quality as well. A lot of that hinges around behaviour change, and again, it's where local leadership is so key, because I think we can be a lot better at unlocking behaviour change at that local level. So quite a lot of work on, you know, how do we kind of publicise that? How do we work with citizens panels, a Green Together forum we've got, and so on some of those issues. Last couple of things to say. You know, public sector is really not going to be the one ultimately that drives the kind of changes that we need to see. I've mentioned the public and the role of behaviour change, but also our economy. And we see, you know, the drive to net zero as being a huge opportunity to unlock the green economy in the West Midlands. So that's a lot of the sort of drive behind this, the push behind this. And we've got 3 high growth clusters in the West Midlands that are particularly focused on different aspects of the green economy, one of which is around batteries and electrification, and our investment zone that was announced last week hangs around the Coventry and Warwick Gigapark, which is very much focused on batteries and electrification. We also recognise that our economy needs something slightly different. So a lot of the focus in terms of decarbonisation and the economy goes to the big producers of energy or the big users of energy, which are very often coastal. We're at the other end of the pipeline when it comes to energy use. So for us, it's all about smart energy systems and distribution, and it's about small and medium-sized enterprises and how they make the energy transition. And much government policy doesn't really address those particular challenges. So we have to have our own economic strategy as to how we help businesses transition, and government, I think, is starting to get aware of that. And then finally, just to mention green finance, because all of this needs paying for, and so we're doing quite a lot of work in the kind of green finance space. There are other combined authorities doing similar, putting together funds, trying to put together projects and pipelines of projects so that private investors can come in and invest at scale. And we've had limited success, I have to be honest, on that front. It's very difficult. I still think that private sectors and the investor market, so to speak, is still needing stronger signals from national government to be able to feel comfortable to invest. But what we can do in the region, we are doing, and I think we've got some sort of small indications of success on that front. I'll finish where Shirley finished. You know, so much more that we could do if more was devolved to us. But through the Trailblazer devolution deal, I think we're heading in the right direction now, and it remains to be seen whether DESNs are really prepared to kind of open up some of that opportunity, if you like, that is created through the Trailblazer devolution deal, particularly around retrofit, to see what more we can do in order to prove that mayoral combined authorities can address climate change alongside national government.
Great, thank you, Ed. Certainly a lot going on in the West Midlands, and yeah, we'll be watching the implementation of the Trailblazer deal and that further transfer of powers to West Midlands and Greater Manchester as well very closely. Shirley, I wanted to come back to you though on this question. I mean, you're obviously watching closely what's happening in these other city regions. What would you like to see change in terms of the powers of the Mayor of London and the GLA, and is that on the cards? I mean, are you having those negotiations in any way with government, which, you know, seems open to devolution to other parts of the country, but London has not really been part of the conversation recently? It seems the focus has been on helping other places to catch up with London.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit like a one-sided conversation. We've certainly been making the case for a long time that if you know, devolution is good for the country. It's good for our ability to deliver in our city, and then what we do in London does help benefit you know, other parts of the country. You know, for one example is the very long-term ask of a long-term capital funding settlement for Transport for London, and we've been making the case about that ability to have that devolved would then give us long-term certainty to bring in the investment that Ed has talked about, but also plan, and then that benefits the supply chain, the bulk of which is outside of London. So 3/4 of that, I think, of those jobs and supply chain and companies are outside of London. So, you know, the sort of Siemens trains or the Alstom trains, or even as you go down to even smaller, the SME manufacturers outside will benefit from that investment. And because we can't plan, you know, we have to go through this churn of as we are doing at the moment, you know, sort of relooking and waiting for government to opine so that we can then work out what can we do. And then because they don't give us the information, then we have to spend a lot of time reprioritising and then keep that negotiation. We would love to have a long-term funding settlement around retrofit. We've been making that case for a long time. You know, all of us, many local authorities, you know, going through this sort of stop-start, flip-flop bidding regime, you know, there's a lot of time and from officers spent on these schemes, and then again for the supply chain, for people to even understand and have the confidence to train and skill up people to, you know, for companies to invest. You know, they don't want to do that. They've seen and they've been burnt by examples in the past, so the Green New Deal, for example, where things were pulled, and we've seen we're experiencing the impacts of that, because, you know, our homes are not fit for purpose for energy efficiency, let alone indeed for you know, adapting to the impacts of climate change that we're seeing now. And that, you know, whilst we talk about net zero, we really shouldn't be forgetting that we need to be adapting our cities, our homes, our businesses to the impacts of climate change that we're already seeing, and that's a really big issue too, that, you know, devolution would help. In London, for example, we've had an adaptation strategy for many years and fed that those sort of policies through the London Plan and various other things, but we've asked Emma Howard-Boyd to chair a sort of review, a London Climate Resilience Review, to understand the preparedness or not, you know, where do we need to really amp up work in London to be more resilient. A lot of that, however, is dependent on government setting standards, setting strategies, which they keep punting on, which is affecting us in London, businesses in London, and putting people at risk, you know, communities at risk as well. So I've talked about transport, a devolution deal there. Housing retrofit, absolutely, as you know, Ed's talked about that, for that 5-year guaranteed funding, that would be fantastic. So we're working with London councils to develop a sort of a view on what we could do collectively to deliver a sort of improved retrofit delivery model, what that would take, and then how that would help in terms of skills. You know, we've done the analysis in terms of the sort of green economy and the jobs in London. It's worth, you know, it's a huge sector, 50 billion worth in sales, and we have an ambition to double that by 2030. But we need that certainty of funding and powers in order to be able to do that. We can carry on and we'll grow that, but it won't be at the pace or at the scale that's needed to really meet this challenge by 2030, let alone 2050.
Okay, terrific. Thanks for that. Okay, so Rosa, I want to come back to you. I mean, we've heard from both Shirley and Ed about what's going on at the devolved level, how further devolution could maybe help those places to move faster. What do you think national government could do to better enable local leaders to lead on this agenda? But also the flip side of that question is, where are the limits of devolution? I mean, what are the things that central government has to get right at that national level?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Ed and Shirley have set it out really well on kind of both halves of that question. So in terms of what central government can do to better support local leaders, I think policy certainty, funding certainty are the real key ones. Like they were saying, it's so hard to build up those supply chains when you've got policy flip-flopping. When you look at housing retrofit particularly, we've had so many different schemes over the last few years. You hear from businesses, well, why would we engage with that scheme? The last one didn't work. It might only last 6 months. They don't want to scale up in the assumption that a scheme will last if it's not necessarily going to last. I think that's really, really important. And similarly, kind of long-term funding settlements, being able to know that you have X amount of funding for a certain period and you can really actually plan what you're going to do there. I think both of those are the really key things. And in terms of what kind of only central government can do, I think, again, it's the kind of setting an overall strategy, setting standards, and then coordinating. You need central government to say, this is how we see us getting to net zero as a country as a whole. And then within that, what they're expecting local areas to do. You need someone doing that kind of overall picture in order to facilitate local areas to then do their parts of it.
Okay, thanks. And I can see lots of questions coming in from the audience, which is great. I'll come to those in a moment. Before that, one final question for you, Jo. I mean, we've heard quite a lot about reducing carbon emissions and so on. A couple of mentions also of adaptation to the effects of climate change, and I want to ask you specifically about that. I mean, what do you see as the role for local leaders in ensuring that places are able to adapt to the effects of climate change?
Yes, because it used to be 20 years ago that we didn't talk about adaptation because it was sort of suggested that in that way you'd failed to meet the challenge of not doing the emissions. But now it's very clear we're in the midst of all these climate change and weather events, and we need to have adaptation. And there's opportunities right there across all areas of policy. We've already heard about planning decisions that need to be compatible with net zero. A new infrastructure that needs to be built at the same time resilient to current and future climate hazards. That will be essential. Many sectors can benefit from an adaptive planning approach where sort of no regrets options are pursued to current climate impacts, but also avoid a lock-in to unsustainable measures. There's on the positive side, there's the co-benefits of acting on climate change, and actually there's very little that you can do on climate change that doesn't have co-benefits. So we've already heard from Ed about the green economy and the co-benefits to economy and jobs and that sort of side of things of acting on climate change. But also, for example, if you reduce fossil fuels both in industry and in transport and improve air quality, that has an immediate effect on lung disease and especially in urban areas. And also climate change action can affect many other areas of life. So if you do things like plant more trees, it will make life better. As I said, I don't think there's much you can do on climate change that doesn't improve health. So active travel is another thing. If you're walking or cycling rather than going in the car, then you're going to be more healthy. So I think all of these things are good. The other side of adaptation is that it typically delivers high benefit to cost ratios. So it's you have to put a bit of investment in, but then you can see the benefits partly in terms of health requirements and things go down and other needs go down. So the benefits are bigger than just the climate ones. I'll leave it there.
Yes, great. I think that's a really important point. Okay, cool. So let's bring in some questions from the audience. There's lots of interesting points coming in. I'd like to start with a question from Jacob Coburn from the Young Foundation, who asks, what role can local leaders play in ensuring that people are not left behind from the transition, especially in recognising those that are most vulnerable and the development of policy and provision that can reduce these risks? So who would like to pick that one? I'm sure Shirley, do you have thoughts on that question?
Yeah, sure. It's absolutely critical. So when Sadiq talks about our work, he talks about social justice a lot and the jargon of just transition, but this is absolutely core to what we're trying to do at the GLA. So on all of our policies, we look to see understand what the impacts are on communities in London and who may be more disadvantaged, and how we might then mitigate that or co-design the policies to make sure that they don't. We have, for example, done some mapping in London with the assistance of Bloomberg Associates to map for example, the sort of areas in London which are more likely to be affected by climate impacts, overlaying that with levels of deprivation, exposure to air pollution, so that we're able to use that to understand where are the areas of London that may need more targeting in terms of our funding, and using that for some of our programmes at the GLA already, and trying to get others in London also to use this. So for example, some of our programmes on tree planting and creating and supporting green spaces, for example, in some of our neighbourhood regeneration programmes, specifically on how do we make sure that people are not disadvantaged. So again, some of our programmes where we help entrepreneurs and sort of SMEs. There's a program called Better Futures where we certainly and it came into its own really during the pandemic, where we provided funding to help people who were single businesses, basically, to with the support and training that they needed to keep going during the pandemic, and then to help them to recover and sort of grow. And that's really targeted at female owners, people from the Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, and so on. And so that's very successful. And then a third example I'd give is we've got a program called Future Neighbourhoods 2030. So using we've identified two areas in London, so it was through a bidding program, one in Somerstown and Camden, and one in Kensington and Chelsea, Nottingdale, where two estates, high levels of deprivation, but where they came forward saying we wanted to co-design strategies, and it was led by the local community. So it was very clear, and it was part of the bidding program, that it wasn't led by a local authority and then done to local people. It was really, what do they want to see? What do they understand to be the challenges? And they've worked with the local authorities and others in the area to co-design programs, and they're implementing, a huge range of initiatives and projects to really show what a sort of a neighbourhood that is climate resilient, net zero by 2030 could look like. And this covers a whole host of issues, from greening, electric vehicle charging, retrofitting homes, zero waste type initiatives. So these are really trying to give people agency. We understand it's very difficult for some communities to get involved and get, are not the sort of traditional recipients. So how do we make sure that they are able to access that funding? And that often starts with the criteria, but also there's a lot of work that our communities team do to get out there and really encourage, a whole host of people, whether it's young people all the way through to faith communities, to get engaged. And certainly we have in London, we developed this during the pandemic, a London Recovery Board, where we brought all the agencies together, whether it was the GLA, the Transport for London, the NHS, other anchor institutions like universities. But on that grouping, we have Business London, we have members of faith communities, and we have members of the youth panel as well. So we get those voices from around London. That's now morphed into a London Partnership Board, where again we have a number of areas of work, missions that we're working on. The one that I'm working on is the Green New Deal mission, but there are others around safety and security, economic recovery, mental health, and so on. So getting that multi-agency sort of input from people, and then they bring in the perspectives from others as well.
Great. Okay, thanks. All right, another question then to come in from Martin Wheatley, which I was going to put to you, Rosa. So Martin notes that more than 15 years ago, Kirklees and other councils showed the effectiveness of a council-led street-by-street approach to domestic retrofit. And his question is, why has central government been so resistant to unlocking the potential of councils to meet this big net zero challenge, for which there isn't, in his view, a credible national approach at the moment? So yeah, I mean, why are we seeing, if you agree with that premise, this caution on the part of central government to let local places lead on this agenda?
Yeah, I saw that question. I think it's a really interesting one. The short answer is I don't really know. I think oh, Ed seems like he might know. Would you like to come in, Ed?
I was going to come back to Ed in a minute.
You carry on, Rosa. I'll come in after you.
Okay. So what I was going to say was, I think the government has started taking more of this approach. So if you look at the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which was brought in, I think, around the same time as the Green Homes Grant, but has been significantly more successful, I would say, in part because it's been working much more closely with local authorities, rather than kind of a very centrally designed and controlled scheme. And in that one, they have been working much more closely with local authorities on like doing social housing in chunks, and that seems to have been more effective. So I would kind of hope that they're looking at the lessons that they can learn from that and seeing how they could kind of apply that more widely.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Well, I mean, as Ed was talking about before, the new Trailblazer includes this pilot, so there is that degree of appetite to test out more locally led approaches and to learn from them. Ed, I'll let you respond on that specific point, but the other question I wanted to put to you specifically has come in from Janine at Lancaster University, who notes that Lancashire has just announced a new devolution deal, as indeed there were 4 new devolution deals announced last week. There's a few others being implemented over the next year or two. So there's a whole bunch of places basically following in the footsteps of places like West Midlands, Greater Manchester, etc. The question is there a framework in place for sharing lessons between local authorities or combined authorities, and what could they learn from your net zero journey in the West Midlands? I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, the Institute for Government has often made the case that one of the benefits of devolution is, or at least should be, that it creates this laboratory for experimentation and testing out different ways to solve common problems. But you then do need to have the framework and systems in place, perhaps, to learn from those experiments and share the lessons. So does that exist at the moment, I suppose, is the question.
Sure. Well, I will come to that question, but there's actually a link between the two questions that we're asking, because one of the main reasons that the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero have given for not wanting to devolve retrofit in particular and other net zero funds is that there is no proof that local authorities or combined authorities can do it better, and it's one of those impossible conundrums that we're in, because the reason there is no proof is because they've never tried it. And this is why the retrofit pilot, as it's being described as part of the devolution deal, is actually part of the wider single settlement, the block grant funding that's going to come to Greater Manchester and to the West Midlands at the next spending review. It is why it's described very much as a pilot, is in order to explore and experiment and to demonstrate that this kind of neighbourhood-based approach or other approaches to retrofit will be more effective than the centralised approach that we've got at the moment. So the onus is always on combined authorities to prove that we can do things better. And Janine then is right to be asking, so how is that information shared and how does that work? I'll be fairly frank here. I think that we could do a lot better. I think that the M10, as it's known, the network of mayoral combined authorities, of which there are now far more than 10, do their best to share information and to share progress. And there is a network of those working on net zero within the combined authorities that meet on a regular basis. Government has set up something called the Local Net Zero Forum, which is largely a process by which government civil servants try to manage us all. So there's not too much information sharing there, but instead what we're doing is saying, look, we can prove to you that we can do things differently and do things better if you devolve more through that forum as well. And I think it's also worth just flagging that some of the think tanks, including Institute for Government, are doing really good work as well to try to get us to share some of the work that we're doing in combined authorities, and that can be made accessible. Even a session like today, I hope, to some extent is addressing some of the concerns that Janine flags. I might just make one more comment going back to the previous question about sort of blockages. One of the key things that keeps getting raised in this space by national government is that they have legally binding targets. Therefore, they cannot trust anybody or pass them on at all. And this is, I think, symptomatic of a kind of wider problem we've got with the way in which government is constructed in the UK, which is this sense that ministers have to be held responsible for every fine last detail of whether a particular house gets retrofitted or not, etc., etc. And actually, it's a sort of immature form of national governance. And really, we need to be able to find ways. And we have said, as West Midlands Combined Authority, we would be happy to take on some of those legally binding targets. We are prepared to work within a carbon budget if there is a quid pro quo, that then we have greater means to set policy for ourselves and the funding to deliver it. So I do think there is a different way of doing this altogether, but it requires central government to get over its kind of highly centralised ministerial responsibility kind of focus that at the moment is so inhibiting.
Yeah, thanks, and that can be a bit of a vicious circle, can't it? That sense of we are responsible, therefore we can't devolve, and therefore we must hold ourselves responsible, keep ourselves responsible for these things. Okay, so question for you, Joe. So John Barrents has put in the chat the following. So he says that Joanna mentioned that agriculture and land use are poorly dealt with in the overall government plan, and he maybe quite rightly notes we haven't spoken so much about this on this panel, perhaps because we don't have representatives of rural areas around the table, so to speak, today. So I just wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about that aspect of the climate agenda, and well, what does need to happen, and also that balance between central and local roles, if you have thoughts on that.
Yes, so I'm a climate physicist. I'm not an expert on agriculture. I brought that up because that's one of the things that the Climate Change Committee said was particularly lacking in terms of planning. But I'm aware there's a lot of work going on in trying to reduce carbon emissions from agricultural practices, particularly from farming of meat, beef and lamb, in terms of how to reduce emissions from that, how to reduce emissions from particular plants. So rice paddy fields give off a lot of methane, for example, and there's research going on into that. And also the whole transport thing, how you can use local produce and not be moving it around all over the country, particularly by fossil fuel driven vehicles, of course. So there's a lot of work going on, and it just requires some people to take notice.
Great. Okay, so we've got about 5 more minutes left, so I'm keen to put another couple of questions to the panel. I mean, there was one question, I think Ed has responded in the chat, but others won't have seen it, about Scotland and Wales, which have substantially more devolved powers than any of England's cities and regions, and certainly have greater certainty over funding and so on. I mean, does anyone on the panel have reflections on what that has enabled those devolved governments to do that maybe parts of England are not currently able to do so much? Shirley, I think I saw you nodding there. Do you want to pick that question up?
Yeah, there's there are loads of examples, I think, but probably one I pick up on is on recycling and waste management and the move to the circular economy. So, we've had another delay to the government's reforms in England for waste management. There's yet another consultation, which means that, so for example, in London, we have 33 different collection and recycling approaches, which the mayor, through the limited powers we have been trying to encourage a move to some standardisation of policies, so that people moving from one borough to another in London can expect to always get a certain level of recycling, and these things will be recycled. But yet they're still different. In Wales, they have been able to go ahead and set policies which has really driven up their recycling rate. So whilst everywhere in the country, certainly in England, our recycling rate has been flatlining for many years, just holding its own, whereas I think the rest of England's recycling rate has been falling. Theirs has been increasing, and they are really focused on the circular economy. So again, whilst we are pushing ahead and doing what we can do, within London. We have an agency with the boroughs called Re-London that does a lot of work in this area, trying to sort of set out best practice guidance and communications campaigns to try and promote some greater action on this. Without that, again, that devolution, you can't really understand what's needed in your region and then push ahead. And I think, you know, there are a lot of things that we've lost over the years, you know, in planning terms. For example, there used to be a Southeast Regional Planning Authority, so we would work very closely with our planning authorities around London so that there would be some collaboration, coordination on action. That was dissolved, so you know, that doesn't exist anymore. So there isn't really a venue to do some of those things. So so yeah, absolutely. I think we'd love some of those powers, I think.
Okay, great. Well, I think yeah, time for maybe one or maximum two more questions. So Rosa, here's a question I was going to put to you. So Robert Morland has asked whether local authorities could be doing much more to encourage residents to take action towards net zero. And I suppose that's the way I was going to ask a similar question that I think we were chatting about in the office the other day, was whether local leaders, whether it's mayors or council leaders, are typically better placed to build consent and to engage citizens for making the changes that might need to be made. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that, including what the UK might be able to learn from other places, which I know is something you've looked at as well.
In terms of, I think I might put it differently. Rather than encouraging residents to take action, I might try to think of it more in terms of helping residents to take action. So I know that one thing that we've seen looking at what other countries are doing, and I think here Greater Manchester has piloted it as well, is having a one-stop shop. So kind of one place online that residents in an area can go to find out information about retrofitting, find trusted suppliers, to kind of not necessarily encourage it, but particularly facilitate that. So try and make it as easy as possible for local residents to take action. So if you can afford to retrofit your home, making it as easy as possible for you to do that and giving you the assurance that you're not going to get a cowboy builder who does it terribly. And I think that local leaders are potentially kind of in a better place to do that than central government, because you can kind of build up that trust locally with residents, and you're potentially in closer contact. And so I think there is definitely scope to kind of facilitate that, helping people to make actions as well as encouraging them to, but particularly making it easier, I think, is the kind of key thing there.
Okay, great. Well, there's absolutely loads more we could talk about. I know there's a number of really interesting questions we've not been able to get on to. Apologies for that. But the Institute for Government will be continuing to follow, research, and hopefully hold more events on this topic and wider both devolution and net zero debates over the coming years. So please do join us again. Just remains for me to say thank you very much to our excellent panel for all their insights and for taking the time to join us. Thank you to everyone for watching, and thank you in particular to the Royal Society who made this event possible. Yeah, that's all from us here at the Institute for Government. Goodbye.